All right, so to finish up, I'm going to do just a very quick summary, just so you have a sense of comparison between the diversity that we have in some of the different groups. Brought this up in a previous lecture. We had sort of a table, but I'm going to use this as well, this kind of little pie chart. And then we're going to talk about sort of an overview of everything, at least the groupings of organisms that were in this sort of second exam block of material. All right. So as far as just the plants go, right, in general, known species. So we had these different groups of plants we talked about throughout the course. And you can see if we look at, usually the term is called extant. Usually people think it's extinct, but extinct means organisms that are no longer alive today. And extant, E-X-T-A-N-T, means species that we know of that are alive today. All right. So sometimes when you read how many species are there in a certain group and you look that up, sometimes it may give you known species, meaning known to humans, from all time, from the fossil record and everything else, versus, known that are extinct versus knowns that are actually alive today. So sometimes those numbers are a little bit differ from one place source to another, and that's partly why, in addition, organisms get regrouped and classified, and so those numbers also tend to change as well. So it's usually just sort of a rough estimate, but a ballpark figure that we could use here is a comparison. So the comparison here is, obviously there's this very large group here, like 75% really of all known plant species are going to be angiosperm. And these are going to be our eudicots. So this is the biggest group, really, of all known. Then we have another, big chunk of it here, about another quarter, of them, and those tend to be also angiosperms. And these are then the monocots. So you can see here, what are angiosperms? Angiosperms are the vascular seed-producing flowering plants. So we're going to see these are all things that allow the plants to become more successful, to spread into more habitats, to reproduce more, and so on. So vascular, being able to grow larger and compete among one another and transport nutrients and store nutrients. The production of a seed, so that the embryos can be spread further distances and they can occupy more habitat. And so there's another group of vascular seed-producing plants, which are here. Okay, and these are going to be the conifers, which are really a representation of the gymnosperms, which are also vascular seed-producing plants, but they're non-flowering. Okay? And so there's a pretty big difference here between the numbers of species, the diversity of organisms that are flowering versus the diversity that are not flowering. Now, the one thing it's not included in this are, say, individuals. So how much biomass is there of one group compared to the other? And there are many forests around the world that are covered in gymnosperms or conifers, right? So they actually do produce a lot of biomass. There are a lot of these organisms there. They are very successful. We just don't see as many different species, of them. So just because there are a lot of different species doesn't mean they're just overall more successful, because they may not occupy that much habitat. They just happen to be very diverse. The diversity then is driven really by a lot more types of competition and the pollination that we see in flowering plants for success in methods of pollination, say attracting pollinators, one being better than another or not being better than another, and that competition drives diversity. So that's kind of one of the things that we see. Whereas the conifers, the pollination is spread through the air, so there isn't that type of competition in terms of the attracting some other organism to fertilize you or spread the pollen, but we see that in the flowering plants. That's one of the reasons. There's other reasons too, but that's one. And so in terms of just numbers, themselves, what are we actually like talking about here? So for the monocots, we have around 60,000. These are all going to be estimated, known species. For the dicots, this is around 190,000 species. For the conifers, it's kind of small. We're really at just like 630 species. And then if we add in the other gymnosperms, which adds maybe like another 300 species. So if we add some of the others into it. Finally, we're left with the mosses and the ferns. Again, each of those, the bryophytes and pterophytes, have other phyla within them. These are just the more general classifications. And they're pretty similar overall. With the bryophytes being around 12,000 known species, and the pterophytes being somewhat similar, somewhere around 11,000 known species, and that's the pterophyta. So that's kind of our breakdown, at least roughly. So now we're going to kind of come back here a second and talk about some of the same things and some other things as well. So this is sort of the general synopsis of groups of organisms covered toward the second block of material for the second exam. So we have our prokaryotic eubacteria. So these are the true bacteria, the eubacteria, and the archaea. We said that they are similar in many ways. They're different. They're similar in that they have circular DNA. They do not have a nuclear membrane. That genetic material is usually concentrated within an area of the cytoplasm, and they have ribosomes, and they do DNA replication. It's mostly how we do, but slightly different because it's circular. They do protein synthesis pretty much the same way, with some slight differences in the ribosomal structures, but overall the process is the same. Many of the same things that we do, biochemical reactions, are similar. Archaea tended to be more unique in terms of their biochemistry, having unique layers to their cell membrane, different varieties of cell wall material or no cell wall, or other use of other materials to make sort of a cell wall protection, and a lot of diversity there. What we have over time, is we see historically some type of symbiosis. And so while we have different hypotheses on how exactly it occurred, which organisms came together, what we do know is it's most likely that certain prokaryotic organisms were symbiotic with other prokaryotic organisms, and that gave rise to eukaryotic cells. So our eukaryotic cells, which then have a nucleus and internal membranes and so forth. And some of our evidence that we see that holds over from the idea of the symbiosis would be structures like chloroplasts and mitochondria that have their own DNA separate from the nucleus, that DNA is circular like the DNA of the prokaryotes, meaning that mitochondria and chloroplasts had a prokaryotic origin. And so it's most likely that then the engulfment of them created then more membranes in a little vesicle, and then that gave rise to more and more structures within inside the cells. So from the eukarya, generally what we have, a first group that we talk about are the Protista, which we said are not really a true kingdom on their own. It's most likely a group that's going to be broken into many different kingdoms. But we kind of collectively talk about them because they're not bacteria or archaea, they are eukaryotes, and they're not plants, and they're not animals, and they're not fungi. They're just everything else. So a majority of them were single-celled, but we do have multicellular protists. Some of them are photosynthetic, some of them are not. Some of them have different kinds of pigments. We have different kinds of algae, the brown algae and the red algae and the golden algae and the green algae. And so the green algae group, which is kind of our path, gave rise to chlorophyta and the Caryophyceae. And so these are the organisms that are the most closely related to our actual plants, so our land plants. I'll start here. And so the plants then actually have special tissues and structures that are not seen in the algae, who lack those different types of true tissues. So then we have the bryophytes, which were our mosses. Remember, these were non-vascular. And they do not produce seeds, so there's no seeds and there's no flowers. They don't really have true roots, or true stems and leaves, because those are structures that have parts of the vascular system in them and are derived from some of those structures, and so they have sort of a alternate version of them that is somewhat similar but not quite the same. With the Pterophyta, we then begin all the vascular plants. So you need to know, just the basics of vascular tissue. So the xylem conducting water up from the roots, also different nutrients from the soils, and then the phloem, which is another type of tissue, which then is carrying the organic materials that were made by photosynthesis in the leaves to the rest of the plant. They are usually very closely associated together with one another, xylem and phloem, in vascular bundles. The phloem still has cytoplasm within those cells, but the xylem doesn't. The xylem cells, once they mature, they die, and they just form these sort of hollow tubes that the liquid is then transported through. That's pretty much the same for all the vascular plants. The organization of the vascular tissue, the organization of the bundles and how it's all put together then does differ, but they're all going to have xylem and phloem. The xylem and phloem will all serve the same roles. There are also then other types of supporting tissues and cells that will add to the structure of the plant and then serve other jobs for storage of nutrients and other sorts of things that they need to do reproductively as well. So that's kind of where we get these are spore producers, though still. They rely on water that the sperm can swim to fertilize the ova. So so these groups here, though, still rely on water. And so these are aquatic. They're beginning to invade terrestrial habitats, or like in muddy areas and all, but they still are tied to water. Then what we see here is kind of a break where we remove our attachment to the water with the production of seeds. We're going to see this with animals, as well, in the vertebrate, animals. So we're going to have vertebrate animals that live in water. They're aquatic fishes. And then the amphibians are still going to be tied to water for reproduction, and their young are going to develop in the water. And then eventually what we'll see is then from amphibian to reptile, the production of an amniotic egg. So essentially they're going to take the water with them, holding the water inside the egg that allows them to travel further onto land and become much more dispersed. And continue that evolution along. That's similar, in the sense that these organisms started off as being aquatic, and as they started to invade land, they had problems and challenges to deal with desiccation and drying out. So one of the ways, instead of just taking the water with them and being full of amniotic fluid like we have in eggs, we have seeds. Okay, so the seeds then protect with a shell-like material, the seed coat, the embryos that develop inside them. So similar, say, to the type of egg that you're familiar with, is it like a seed. There's nourishing material inside it, an embryo develops inside it, there's a protective coating on the outside. So there are certain similarities. If you're not that familiar with seeds, but you're familiar with an egg, you can kind of think like, oh, it's kind of like a plant egg. Sort of. Not exactly, all kinds of different tissues and all, but yeah, some of the same sorts of jobs are being accomplished by these. So nutrients for the embryo itself develops inside it. It's protective and nourishing. And so then the seeds can also be distributed, in gymnosperms. These are the conifers, though, and so the pollen is just carried by air to fertilize. And then there's a little pollen tube that's produced, and that's going to be the same in both of them. So there are similarities between the seeds in both of them, and then a couple differences. We then see that the angiosperms now will produce flowers, whereas the gymnosperms don't. And so they all produce the flowers, right? Monocots and the dicots. And then the monocots don't produce wood, but the eudicots actually do. So they can have secondary growth, so we get these organisms that then become very large, as well. Now, gymnosperms can have secondary growth. So they can produce wood. Material very similar to the way that the angiosperms do, but not exactly the same. They have their own tissue organization that allows that to happen. That's it's all the material that kind of leads into the exam. You would want to do your readings as well, kind of looking through slides that are produced statically that have a lot of the information nicely organized with pictures and typed in tables and text. But these lectures will give you then some of the specific direction for focus. What should I be focused on a little bit more? Pretty much more the things that I'm choosing to include in the lectures to focus in on, and some of the things that I'm not focusing in on you might need from the slides, but a lot of it is the slides are producing extra background, additional material that fills in the big picture and provides some maybe very nicely organized material as well that you could use while studying. So you should definitely use that material as well, but these lectures that cover the material are the sort of primary direction for you as far as your focus. And that's going to be it. So we'll be moving on after an exam on this material. We'll be going into fungi next, which will really also come from the Protista, then to fungi, and then we'll go into animals after them, which again, we'll also go back to the Protista to go to animals. So we're going to come back to the Protista a couple times as well, but now this group, this branch is all from the bacteria to the protists and then through the plants. That's what we're covering.